We will overrun at the end. I want briefly to recap one or two things I was saying on Tuesday and then move on to talk about time. But I want to bridge between what I was saying to you on Tuesday about rites of passage and Van Gennep, because, as I said then, one of the things which rites of passage are marking is precisely time itself. They are very often calendrical rituals. And it's worth adding that very often initiation rites or king installation rites or royal rituals, etc., throughout the world are very often geared up to important cosmic events, particularly the equinoxes and solstices, so that there are crossovers between social time and cosmic time. Now, one of the point that Van Gennep was making was that what interested Van Gennep was that these rituals had a particular common pattern which consisted of three phases: a phase of separation, a phase of what he called liminality, and a phase of incorporation. And you can predict that different kinds of rituals will stress these in different ways. So needless to say, funeral rites will tend to stress separation, and birth rites will tend to stress incorporation. And it's the case that initiation rites typically stress the marginal middle bit. And Van Gennep's book, very short book, but has had a profound influence, has attracted attention from three rather different theoretical quarters. So that if you were to take the example of a wedding, you could ask three kinds of questions about it, which represent or correspond to three different complementary, not mutually exclusive, theoretical approaches. If you wish to ask, you can approach it in functionalist terms by asking, what does the wedding do? What social purposes does it serve? So that you could talk about legitimation of new statuses, bringing different groups together, etc. You could then, but that sort of thing won't tell you, that approach won't tell you why people dress up and do all the funny things that they do in weddings. You could then look at what is going on in the wedding and ask questions about symbolism. You could ask why the bride wore white and say, well, she must be pure, a virgin, etc. You could ask questions about what's going on in cutting the wedding cake. And in fact, I want to give you a lecture about cutting wedding cakes later on in this series. It might be sexual symbolism, but it might not be. But obviously, if you ask questions about what things mean, you're inexorably going to be asking very culturally specific questions, because the symbolism of white that we see in the wedding is certainly not universal. Other people wear different colors in weddings, and other people attach all sorts of different kinds of meanings to the color white, so that we're necessarily going to be looking at the specificities of cultures if we opt for symbolic analysis. The third way in which we can approach it, which is the kind of structuralist view, is to say, well, never mind the content, the symbolic content, let's look at how the thing is patterned and think cross-culturally. Are there common patterns between these different rituals? And it seems to be the case that there are indeed common patterns, and I want to talk about some common patterning in relation to time in a second. And that poses some rather interesting questions, because it raises the question as to why, in all sorts of different parts of the world, if people do the same kinds of ritual behavior for the same purposes, do they do so because they've all been in contact with one another? In other words, there's a diffusion of ideas. Well, partially yes, but partially no, because even the societies which are unrelated, historically unrelated, seem to come up with the same sets of ideas. So that might, it may not, but it's a possibility, at least a hypothesis, that this suggests that people, in some sense, typically construct their cultures in the same ways. And that's the sort of thing that Levi-Strauss and others have been trying to suggest. So as I would stress, though, that these three approaches are not mutually exclusive. They're asking different kinds of questions. I also went on to say that Leach and Mary Douglas in particular used Van Gennep's schema to generate a thesis about what they called taboo. And what they mean by taboo is special ritual behavior, either of a rather odd kind, typically carnivalesque behavior, which I'll come back to, so that it's special behavior which is marked in some way, which marks things out as either being rather potent or rather threatening. So that what their argument in brief is that that ritual or ritual act, a ritual approach, ritualization serves to mark out categories, point number one. And second, that what Van Gennep called the liminal space, has its own, or the liminal phase, has its own special space. So that if we take the example of what happens over Christmas, it isn't the case that one year neatly ends and the other year neatly begins. What we seem to want to do is to put something, a sort of 10 dog days when everything used to shut down, but now of course it's sales time. But so that we have a special time where we all party and dress up in funny clothes, which comes between the two categories, so that this has its own independent space. And I said that when I went through initiation in northwest Amazonia, we had a first ritual, and then we spent a month locked up in a little hut, eating nasty diet, vomiting in the morning and doing all sorts of other things. And then we were allowed back into normality. So that's it's this space, this special space that interests them. And the third point they make is that sometimes people go to great lengths apparently to keep categories separate. So there's a lot of behavior, which is behavior with respect to dirt, for instance, cleanliness, etc., is category forming. It's stopping things mixing together. But at other times in our lives and other societies' lives, we seem to bring them together, so that and sometimes that is a matter of bringing death and life together. So I suggested that All Souls and Halloween is underlying the sort of largely American-derived cult of Halloween that we see at the moment is an old religious festival of All Saints, which is precisely when the living and the dead came together. Why do they come together? Well, because in a sense that's useful for society, it's potent, but then we send them back away again. Now, what I want to do now today is to talk about time, and I want to do really three things about time. Firstly, I want to look a little bit more about how people ritualize time, and talk briefly about some ideas of Edmund Leach about why it might be that people all over the world seem to ritualize time in more or less the same way. So that's my first point. I then want to deal with a classic example of the ethnography or the anthropology of time, which is Evans Pritchard's work on the Nua. And I want to deal with this partly because it's quite interesting ethnography, but the real point is simply that this is a classic case. This is whenever anthropologists or sociologists or philosophers write about time in a comparative perspective, they go back to Evans Pritchard's work because it's extremely well described and analysed. But it raises a very interesting point, which was the point I raised right at the beginning of these lectures, which is to what extent cultures are different. Or to put it differently, to what extent do people in different cultures think differently? And that poses some quite serious philosophical problems in the end, because if it was really the case that people absolutely thought differently, then it would be the whole anthropological enterprise would be rather difficult. Imagine trying to do field research amongst cats. It's very probable that cats don't think like us, so that the translation problems would not simply be linguistic, but they would be cognitive. The cats, I think, can assume, live in a rather different universe from ourselves. So that this calls the ideas that Evans Pritchard is making a strong claim. He's suggesting that Noah are very different from us. And I want to suggest that actually he's only partially right. And so I want to use Evans Pritchard's work to ask questions about what does that say about our own experience of time. And that leads me on to a point about what culture is, whether culture is official, common sense, what we know culture, or whether there are things which we take for granted but which are there all along. So anyhow, let's begin with ritual. Now, I think, I can't remember whether I did or didn't, but if I didn't, I should have done. I think I mentioned that one very clear example of this schema that Van Gennep develops is the sequence which we're actually involved in at the moment, which is the sequence which goes from Carnival, Lent, and Easter. And we can see that this sequence has a very clear pattern. We don't in this country, because we're Protestants, or we live in a largely Protestant influence, we don't actually do Carnival, and when we do, it's the Notting Hill Carnival in August, which has rather different, well, it has partly Catholic roots through the West Indies, but it's largely a different sort of carnival. But if we were in Rio, we would have just been through Carnival, a real bash where people did all sorts of very bizarre things. They made bizarre noises, dressed in bizarre ways. And then notionally everybody is buttoned up tight for 40 days. They're supposed to fast and be good and all that. Carnival is carnivale, goodbye to meat. And then there will be another kind of ritual which is quite the opposite of the Rio Carnival kind of ritual, which is that everybody will dress up in suits and dresses which look a bit like bridal dresses and go to Mass on Sunday. So here is Van Gennep's pattern very clearly illustrated. Now what Leach suggested in his book Rethinking Anthropology, there are a section called Two Essays on Time, one of which is called Time and, they're called Time, one of them, and Time and False Noses, that's right. Anyhow, what Leach argues in these essays is that our experience of time, our sense of time, it comes very much from rituals. And what he means by rituals is rituals in this extended sense, not only fancy dress or religious rituals, but special behavior. And I suggested on Tuesday that one of the sort of points he's making is that even lunchtime can be seen as a ritual in relation to work, that lunchtime separates morning and afternoon. So what Leach is saying is that our lives consist of alternations between work and holidays, which are also holy days. Our lives consists of alternations between feasts and fasts, etc. So that there is an alternation, a back and forth swing between two modalities of experience. And that typically we experience these rituals, very often we experience them, as a conjunction between, as an alternation between formality and masquerade. And sometimes the formality is at this end and the masquerade is at that end, so that in the church service the formality is here and the masquerade is in the best man's speech and the tin cans on the cars. In the Easter sequence, the masquerade is here and the formality is the other point. But it doesn't really matter which way, but the point is that there is this alternation. And Leach also suggests that this movement out into special time is marked by a very particular ritual marking, which is that of inversion, transgression, turning things upside down. So that it is characteristically in calendrical rituals which we see things like status or hierarchy inversion. We have occasions in which people who are conventionally more powerful or of higher status are brought low, and people who are of low status assume positions of power. And we also get cross-dressing. Men dress as women, women dress as men. Well, we don't do that much of that, or I don't, over Christmas, but remember what happens in the pantomime. The pantomime is obligatory cross-dressing. The principal boy has to be a woman. And each asks the question, why do we get this near universal pattern, and it is near universal. Just another point to make, to emphasize, is that it is actually geared up, this pattern is of course geared up with the solar cycle. So here we have the solstices, the summer solstice and the winter solstice, and here we have the equinoxes. So here we have Christmas, Easter, the Feast of St. John, and All Saints. And this patterning of ritual focusing there is very frequent, and the fact that we get role reversal at these points is also characteristic. I won't go into it. Let's give you some examples. In the Ashanti New Year in Ghana, the New Yam Festival, in the traditional Ashanti New Year, the king and all the high status people were pelted with filth, etc., and the poor people took over the city of Kumasi. In Brazil, we don't only get carnival here, but we get a whole Brazil, the really big party time in Brazil is San Juan, the Festa de San Juan. So here, the same pattern, and here we've got, what have we got here? We've got Halloween, and it isn't just Halloween, it's also, miraculously, good conjunction, we get loud noises, fireworks, etc. So that the pattern is there wherever we look. Why this pattern? Well, what Leach is suggesting is that ritual is serving to create, in a sense, to give us a notion of time. And he suggests that we have two basic experiences of time. On the one hand, we see time as an alternation, so that night follows day, and summer follows winter, follows summer, follows winter. So that's one kind of experience of time, is a repetitive alternation. And the other kind of time that we see, that's what he calls cyclical time. The other kind of time he calls linear time. Linear time is the experience of generations succeeding one another, and also our own experience, our own bodily experience of time, in which we are born, grow progressively older, and then die. And what Leach suggests then is that religious thought operates to suggest that cyclical time and linear time are actually one and the same thing, that they're not different at all. And so that he's suggesting that what ritual does is to suggest in our heads that life on earth, in other words, linear time, is really just a process, a cyclical process. And we can see parts of this in the effective Christian message of Christmas and Easter. The world in the northern hemisphere grows old over the winter. The leaves come off the trees, the grass disappears, everything looks dead except for holly and ivy. And right in the middle of death, we get birth, the birth of Christ. And we then move onwards, so that out of death comes birth, and out of birth comes death at Easter. But what does Easter suggest? But that we have conquered death, and so life goes on again. So that what we take to be what we might take to be an irreversible process, linear time, turns out by the ritual message to be cyclical time, that one follows the other as an alternation. So that the message is that the tomb is the cradle of the soul, so that out of death comes life. And that sort of idea, I've given you a very brief gloss of a Christian version of it, but that idea is very, very common in a very large number of religions throughout the world. And how do we get this? What is the mechanism that puts this idea into people's heads? Well, it is, suggests Leach, the alternation between formality and masquerade itself, that it is this backward and forward swing between these two modes of ritual being that suggest this way, that formality and masquerade are like death, and rebirth. And secondly, that it's also, so it's suggested by this alternation and also suggested by the fact that there's another possible mode of existence on Earth, which is the mode signalled by role reversal itself. What is role reversal? A time of sexual license, cross-dressing, etc. So I looked up this morning just to, on the internet, if you look up Feast of Fools, in medieval times in Britain and Europe, there was a quite extraordinary set of events that went on in the church around Christmas time. So that we had on St. Nicholas Day, on the 6th of December, a boy bishop was elected and a mock mass was celebrated, so that the clergy themselves turned the system upside down. Instead of having a full bishop, they took a small boy and elected him as bishop. In Rouen in particular, but in various parts of France, they had the Feast of Asses, so that during the Feast of Asses, which typically took place on the 1st of January, they would lead a donkey into the church with a clergyman seated backwards on the donkey, and instead of singing the Kyrie, they all brayed like asses, and that was the song, and all the prayers were addressed to asses, and instead of burning incense, they burnt old boots and old bits of books, etc. So that the world was quite literally turned upside down. Well, yes, it's relatively rare today, but as I've suggested, there are some remnants of this in the society you see around you, one of which is, of course, the pantomime. But another one is the office party. What happens at the office party? Well, the office parties, of course, these rituals tend to happen in hierarchical situations, like the army, like traditional firms, etc. What happens at the office party? The world is turned upside down. The office party is organized by the secretaries. They have the food and drink and music which they like, and it's all, the behavior is quite different. The bosses flirt with the secretaries, and sometimes with disastrous consequences, and everything is momentarily turned upside down. It also happens in Cambridge colleges to a certain extent. It used to happen quite dramatically, these rituals, but it still happens a little bit. In King's, for instance, in January, the fellows wait on the servants, and people say, well, this is of course because the servants need their day off, the college staff need their day off, and who's going to, if they have their own party, who's going to do the waiting for them? They can't afford to hire in special waiters, so the fellows do the waiting for the people who normally do the waiting. Well, yes, it may have a rational reason, but I suggest that it's also part of the Christmas spirit. My wife saw the same thing. She became a medical student. She was an anthropologist until the age of 36. Then she became a medical student, and at the medics' Christmas party, it started out fairly, they were all dressed up in dinner jackets and black ties and the rest of it. And they went to a restaurant in Huntingdon, a very posh restaurant. It all started normally. But after the first course, they started dipping their bread rolls in wine and pelting them at each other, and this included the consultant physicians. And by the third course, and apparently this was obligatory custom amongst medical students, the consultants had to stand on the tables and tell dirty jokes. So you ask yourself, what is going on? Well, Leach thinks it's that sacred time is running in reverse. In other words, if time can run in reverse, then it suggests that life can come after death. Well, maybe it's suggestive, but if you don't believe Leach, then you still have to answer the question, why the cross-cultural similarities? I find his ideas not entirely convincing, but I think that he's on the right track. Before I move or change gear and start talking about the Nuer, I just want to draw some cross-referencing. I haven't got time to go into it now, but I would note, you want to bear in mind 2 points, that also that time is very very heavily in food and time are linked up together. Not long now, you will be able to buy hot cross buns in Fitzbilly's across the road as we go out of the lecture. There are a whole series of ways in which food and time are geared up together. I've suggested another one about serving your guests with breakfast cereals at dinner parties, etc. And the other point is that time is very much embodied. And here's a bit of culture, and I want to give a lecture later about the body. But here is a bit of culture which you take for granted, and yet which is pretty profound and pretty remarkable, is the fact that you are all potty trained. Your bodies have a temporal rhythm which is largely artificial. Came from mum and dad, and I learnt this that in the Amazon they have a different schema. We basically feel that we ought to shit in the morning. That's the proper place. In fact, when I was at school, we used to have to go to matron. I was at a horrible British public school, and we used to have to go to matron. We had to do something called ticking off. So here was really temporalizing our bodies. We had to check that we had actually shat that morning. And if we didn't, matron used to give us a spoon of milk and magnesia. And it always amazed me how honest my fellow students or pupils were, that they rigorously confessed to what they hadn't done in the morning. Anyhow, so here was an extreme example of the socialization of time in the regime of a public school. When I went to Amazonia, one of the first things the Indians said to me is, well, I'd go out in the morning, you have to go and shit in the bushes, and they'd say, where have you been? I said, I've been to shit. They said, what, shitting in the morning? Disgusting. And I said, what do you mean disgusting? Don't you? And they said, of course not. Can you imagine lying in bed all night with that stuff churning around inside you? We always shit in the evenings. And in fact, they do, so that they have a different culture about body. So, but here is culture. I mean, of course, polite lecturers don't talk about these things, but this is part of culture. This is part of embodied culture, which is taken for granted. Let's move on then. Without saying any more about that, let's move on to the Nuer. Now, the Nuer, some of you will probably have come across the Nuer already in your Part 1 essays. The Nuer are pastoralists who live in southern Sudan. In fact, they're constantly, or they were until relatively recently, constantly in the news because of the civil war between the north and south of Sudan. The Sudan People's Liberation Army, the SPLA, which has been fighting the north, are by and large Nuer, but also some Dinka. So that those are who the Nuer are. Now, as I say, the interest of the Nuer is partly they are interesting, they're a well-described society, but also because they have been taken as the type case of what we call relativity of cultural categories. Is time culturally specific? Are our understandings of, conceptualizations of, experience of time, is that something which is particular to particular cultures, as some anthropologists have argued, or is it something which is ultimately the same thing everywhere? And this is part of a much wider debate about the relation between culture and cognition, which I want to come back to in my very last lecture. Anyhow, Evans Pritchard's book, I want to develop two main themes. The first one is to explain to you what Evans Pritchard says about Nuer understandings of time and space, because for Evans Pritchard these are keys to the understanding of the Nuer political system. And then I want to talk about Evans Pritchard's ideas in relation to our own. Evans Pritchard tells us that we have a very different notion of time from the Nuer, and I want to query that. Now, what Evans Pritchard does is he distinguishes between two kinds of time, which he calls ecological time and structural time. What he means by ecological time is ideas about time which are derived from the experience of human relations with the natural environment. But it's not quite, it isn't the natural environment itself, it's how the Nua engage with and experience the natural environment. In other words, it's not just the seasons, but it's what the Nua do in relation to the seasons. And it's not just about day and night, but what the Nua do in relation to day and night. So that one of the things that happen, the Nua live on the plains of the Nile, which floods every year. And so that their life consists of an alternation between points at which they're wandering around over the plains, herding cattle, and then when the rivers rise, they have to move on to mounds where they grow crops. So that one of their experiences of time is this experience, this alternation between two modes of life, so that one period of the year is extremely social and concentrated, the other is dispersed, etc. So that time is therefore about the activities that people do. And it's also about work, principally cattle care and feeding themselves. So Evans Pritchard tells us that for the Nua, time is a relationship between activities. That's where they get their ideas from time. And as I say, part of it is seasonal, an alternation between the dry and wet season, but there's also a daily cycle. And Evans Pritchard says that the Nua have what he calls a cattle. They have what he calls a cattle clock, so that sometimes they segment time with reference to cattle herding activities, but they also segment time with reference to the sun. They say he'll be arriving at that point there. The cattle clock is simply the round of pastoral activities. We're going to leave at milking time, or they refer to not 6 o'clock, but time for taking the cattle from the cattle byre, etc. Now, unlike our ideas of lunchtime, tea time, supper time, or 6 a.m., these have gender and age connotations. They're not the same for everybody, because different sexes and different ages do different things at different times, so that he's suggesting that different people may experience time in slightly different ways. He then says that the solar clock is actually really the cattle clock in a different guise, because it's simply the cattle clock under another name, so that people know if you say, well, we'll do it at sunrise, that instantly connotes all the activities that happen at sunrise. So in conclusion, Evans Pritchard's ecological time consists of natural processes which are mediated by seasonal and daily human activities. And the critical point he wants to say is that these units of time are not homogeneous, so that, for instance, there's an awful lot of things you do in the morning, so that the morning is somehow longer and more full of time than the rather boring bits in the afternoon. So that the Nua day has qualitatively different kinds of time. He then goes on to distinguish this from what he calls structural time. And what he means by structural time is the way that time relates to society itself. One form of structural time is simply events. It happened when we were living in such and such a cattle camp. But of course that sort of time is specific to the group of people concerned. Then the Nua have 9 age sets, so that there are only 9 age sets, so that periodically across Nua land everybody goes through a new cycle of initiation, so that you're all recruited into a new age set, one of 9 named age sets which kind of succeed each other through time. And people can say, well, it happened when the such and such name set was initiated, or when the last people of the such and such name set died out, etc. So that's age set time. And then there is what he calls lineage structural time, which is really as follows, that the Nua have the idea that they're all descended from a common ancestor. And they trace their genealogies down to this ancestor. Now, obviously, every generation, they should, in theory, the genealogies should get longer and longer and longer. But what in fact they do is they compress the bit in the middle so that they only remember, they're constantly shifting generations up so that the total genealogy time depth is roughly constant. There are only, I can't remember how many generations it is, but only n generations between the present and the past. But people use this system as a calculus for relationships. So these people here would say, well, we're related to the D's by going up and then down again. So that, and people who are distantly related in time, i.e. you have to go far back to find a common ancestor, are also distantly related in space. They live typically far apart and have relatively less close social relations. So that's what he means by lineage time. It's the way in which people conceive of their relations with each other according to a temporal framework. But of course, this thing is really, it looks as if the time is operating down this way, that the past explains the present, but really it's the other way around, that what people are doing is looking at contemporary reality and arranging the past in order to fit it to the contemporary way in which groups, because some groups are obviously going to die out, etc. So this is what he means by structural time. So that this is essentially, although it looks as if it's moving, it's ultimately a static conception of time because of this business of compressing the intermediary generations. Now, Evans-Pritchard builds up an implicit contrast between us and them. He's saying that newer time is cyclical, variable, ecological, and that structural, or the ecological time is cyclical and variable, and that structural time is progressive but really static, etc. And he's saying, well, of course, what we have is linear, homogeneous clock time, time which is regular in measured units, measured against a single linear scale, and in which the units are of exact equivalence and follow each other one after the other. So, and here I quote him, he says, the Nuer have no word for time. They can't imagine time as a thing they could waste or lose. They don't feel up against it. And he says, the Nuer are fortunate. Now, what Evans-Pritchard is doing here is in fact appealing to one common sense, familiar mode of time which we all know, which is precisely clock time. The time which it's the official understanding of time, the one that we're taught in school. And he's using that. He's basically saying, look, you all know what time is, don't you, dear readers? Time is like this for us, and that's very different from what it is for the Nuer. And he takes it for granted that we know this. But of course, and when he says the Nuer are fortunate, he's pointing to that. He's saying that you know what time is, the Nuer don't suffer from that temporal regime. But if you think for a moment, of course, our experience of time is not just clock time and that kind of time. Our experience of time is also, for instance, geared up with work. And in fact, even clock time itself is made possible by a special techno-ecological system, techno-economic system. So that, for instance, our clock time is intimately related with our work time. They're not separate modes of time at all. And this was a point that E.P. Thompson made, and I put his paper on your reading list, that one of E.P. Thompson's themes is the economic origins of our own notion of regular clock time, that the development of clock time goes hand in hand with factory production, precisely because labor, the basic unit of production, the basic unit of capitalist production, was itself measured in time, labor time, so that work, our own particular kind of work, is very much linked up with our ideas of clocks. So that in that sense, although we don't have cattle clocks, we certainly have an experience of work time. Now, the second point is that, of course, our experience of time is actually much more varied than Evans-Pritchard would like to suggest. There isn't just one complex, simple, elegant conception of time. We also think and use time in various rather newer-like ways. And also, of course, we is a rather big generalization, because depending on who we are, our experience of time is very different from each other. So that if you were a fireman or firewoman, your experience, or if you were a night worker, your experience of time would be very different from us in this room. If you lived in a port as a fisherman, your experience of time would be very, very close in a sense to what Evans Pritchard means by ecological time. That you would experience time in relation to tides and in relation to the possibilities of fishing itself. And also, time, just like for the newer, other aspects of our time certainly does have different qualities, values and meanings. It's not all homogeneous at all. We have food times and drinks times, and they are very culturally specific. Not so long ago in Britain, you could only get a drink after 6, between 6 and before 11 o'clock at night in a pub. Now we're going for 24-hour opening. And of course, in your own experience, you know that daytime is quite different from evening time. It would be perfectly possible to have this lecture at 8 o'clock at night, but it's not proper. It wouldn't be right to do that in our conception of time and time allocation. There are other things that you do in the evenings, but of course there are lots of serious meetings going on, the Moral Science Club, Amnesty International, etc. All of those things function at night, but we have ideas about the appropriate use of time. We also have our equivalents of structural time, so that we divide initially we divide the time into a sequence of years, decades, centuries, and millennia. But the 0 points for these systems are typically arbitrary, and one of the things which revolutionary governments do is usually to recalibrate the point zeros, so that during the French Revolution they tried to recalibrate so that time began from the revolution. In Cambodia, under Pol Pot, they abolished the old system of time and made the revolution the 0 point. And of course, the birth of Christ is itself a relatively arbitrary time, and you remember all those debates during the year 2000 about whether actually the millennium was the year 2000 or the year before. And just like we have non-homogeneous decades, although in principle each decade seems to or should last 10 years, in practice they don't seem to. So that some of them, the 60s, particularly in the hands of the record industry, seems to last far longer than most of the others, and then there are other marked ones like the Roaring 20s, the yuppie 80s, etc. So that our experience of time then is not, as Evans Pritchard suggests, quite as homogeneous as we think. Now, I want to conclude then, and my conclusion is really that my point is not simply that we can find a series of parallels in. My point is not simply to say that Evans Pritchard is wrong and that of course we can find endless parallels between ourselves and the newer. Of course we can, but there are some significant differences. Our experience of time is in some senses quite different precisely because we don't live like the newer, and also we have no obvious parallel with the newer notion of lineage time. My point is not that, but simply that our sense of time, our experience of time and our use of time is much less standardized than Evans Pritchard implies, and also much less standardized than we tend to think. And this is to return to my point about where is culture. Is culture what we're told officially, or is it things which are there which we take for granted? If you ask people about time, they're likely to talk about clock time. They don't think of all the other ways of experiencing time because those are taken for granted. But clock time or calendar time is just one of many schemes that in fact we use in our daily lives. But it's the one that we use self-consciously, the one that we know that we know. It's the official part of culture. But it's not the only one that we know implicitly. There are lots of other ones which we normally don't think about. And that leads me to my final point, which is that there's a kind of double reflexivity in anthropology, that what anthropologists are doing is on the one hand, there's a triple reflexivity within anthropology. On the one hand, anthropologists are looking at other societies in order to investigate them because they are of interest in and of their own right. But they're also using other societies in order to make things in order to render visible things which we tend to take for granted in our own society. And I hope that to some extent I've persuaded you that some of the odd patternings that you see in front of your eyes, and you're seeing at the moment, for instance, the patterning of time in relation to Carnival, Lent and Easter, these are things which we are not consciously thinking about as patterns, but I think the patterns are nonetheless there. So that we can use aspects of other societies to the shock or the difference of other societies to make us self-aware about things which we normally just do without reflection. So that we can use, in other words, the image of the other society as a mirror. But there's a third point that I think anthropologists, the third operation that anthropologists are engaged in, which is a kind of reflexivity about the categories with which we use to analyze culture itself. And this was a point I was trying to suggest at the end of my first lecture on culture, that if culture is itself something which is relative to particular cultures, then that might relativize the categories with which we understand other cultures. In other words, we have to think about, when we're trying to analyze other cultures, we have to be very self-critical about the categories that we're using in analyzing our own cultures. And I've tried to give you an example of this, that what Evans-Pritchard, I think where Evans-Pritchard falls down, I think he produces an interesting analysis, but I think where he falls down is not actually turning the mirror fully back on himself and being quite self-critical enough. What he's not saying is, well, am I really, he's saying, I'm going to analyze the Nuer, but what he doesn't quite do is to analyze his own categories of time and to see that actually he's presenting the Nuer through our own, there is a sense in which he's actually presenting the Nuer through a form of inverse ethnocentrism. In other words, he's transposing particular notions, his own particular notions of time derived from us, into a contrast between us and them. Well, rather as time would have it, of course, if I'm lecturing on time, instead of running out of time, which is what I feared, I cut out a bit, but I've ended up finishing too early. But anyhow, never mind. You can go and enjoy yourselves.